and that German. It was German based. So the people that ended up with a lot of his work were German, but also he had long correspondences with certain individuals. One of them being a legal professor called Ernst von Hippel, and a lot of the archives were with the von Hippel family. They were then inherited by Martin Krieler, another German legal professor, and he actually was the one that inherited all things Tombergian in terms of the papers. So, and it's actually been quite difficult to get anything out in English. I think, Robert Powell was given the manuscript of Meditations on the Tarot by, I think, Tomberg's former secretary, a lady in Holland. So again, that didn't come via Germany. So he was able to publish that. But
wasn't the Meditations originally wasn't it originally in French? Was that the
well, apparently what happened was, so he wrote it, and then a version got circulated without his permission during his life in Holland. Then apparently quite a poor version came out in German, and then the good version came out in French.
I got it.
And that, yeah, he did write it, and he did write it in French. Wife often. It was considered to be a kind of the language of the upper classes in Russia. They learned Russian, they learned different languages, and French was the kind of what the aristocrats were taught. So it was, and also there's a strong esoteric connection with France, with Tomberg and this whole tradition. So all kinds of reasons why the French language was suitable, and it was dedicated to Our Lady of Chartres. So, but yeah, so then we got the English version, and we don't have much else. It was hugely, influential in Europe, and there was a really powerful connection between France and Russia for many years, especially esoterically and with the upper classes. So yes, it wouldn't surprise me. I think, between French, English and Spanish, those sort of cover the main European languages and regions. But there is a sort of drive to bring, I think they're in the process of bringing this out in English. So obviously we'll all be thrilled when that finally happens, because I think that his work has been, I think I mentioned it last time, but it's been quite difficult to get the papers out of the archives. I think there's been some resistance. I don't know if people have been working with it on their own. I think certainly with the Anthroposophical Society. Do you know that there's been a big controversy with Anthroposophy and Valentin Tomberg? Because that was one of the things that kind of, I thought we need to establish how much people know before we can go into it meaningfully.
I'd be interested in more background on that, because it's not very clear to me, because I understand. I was reading a little bit about that last night, was reading a little bit about Balthazar's notes on this, where he was talking about the division seems to be fundamentally that the anthroposophists, according to Tomberg, they just went the way of intellectuality and concepts, and taking the idea of spiritual science and running with that, and really just sort of become, branding it a science, as opposed to what, Tomberg felt that it needed to be infused with the divine life, rather than being emphasis on concepts. That's just a really simplistic thing that I read.
That's certainly correct, but there was actually a proper schism between them, and this is one of the things I kind of go into. But we can sort of just maybe have a loose discussion about it, especially if there's only us three, because we might find it more useful, because there's so many different areas of his life. There's the Russian period, and the whole occultism with Meaves, and that whole, the escape from Russia and what that entailed, his life in Estonia, and then there's this monumental anthroposophical period, then the Catholic period, life in England. But what happened was, he after he'd escaped as a refugee from Estonia. I mean, shall I? I'll begin, shall I? I did start
Please do. Launch in.
You must stop, but this is long. I don't think we'll get through it. So, feel free to interrupt me, and if it's droning on a bit, because there is a lot to get through.
Are you okay Mark, listening to this? Because I know Charles.
Yeah, I'm here just because I'm fascinated by this, and I don't have these German tomes, nor do I read German, and I'm happy to just soak up whatever it is that you have to share. So thank you for doing this work.
And thank you for sort of coming to listen, because I that's actually how I felt. I was always avid for any kind of information I could find about Valentin Tomberg, and because there was nothing in English, I was even thrilled just to own this German book, you know, when it came through the post.
Just consider us to be your sort of sounding board right now, you know?
Yeah, and I do think it's really important because he's such a monumental figure in the spiritual life of humanity, and especially the modern age, and you know, the legacy of anthroposophy and the legacy of Catholicism, actually, they all, and occultism and Martinism, they all kind of dovetail in this figure of Valentin Tomberg, who isn't really well known. Now, what was I going to write? So, oh yeah, I wanted to share a few of their letters, because I thought those are actually, you know, penned by the Tomberg family, and some of the most illuminating things, obviously, that you can read in the book. Now, this one was written by his wife Maria in 1947. This is just before they moved to England, and even though I'm sort of starting in the middle, I thought it would be an interesting kind of vignette. She was writing to I haven't made a note of who it was. It was friends on the continent. And she says, "Dear ones, life has two sides. One shows how it looks, the other as it is. In our lives, everything seems to look rather joyless. Of course, you will find islands of peace in our two emigrations. Recently, Valentin was asked by an Englishman, 'You know so much, Dr. Tomberg. What are you actually by profession?' Without thinking, Valentin answered, notice, without thinking, 'I'm a refugee by profession, and between the two escapes, I dealt with different things accordingly.' To which, of course, the Englishman made big eyes full of surprise, and I didn't even feel like laughing," she concludes.
Wow.
I wanted to start with that because one of the overriding impressions I got from what I could glean from his biography, as distinct from his spiritual writing, was a sense of profound suffering, it really made me sort of pause for thought and rewind and sort of look at his whole personality and what he'd come up with, because, you know, I read Meditation on the Tower, and of course you get hints of it, but you know, there's a lightness of touch with his writing, and you know, it's on a different level. It's not about him, it's the spiritual work. So, you know, he's not writing a biography, and as far as I know, he hasn't left a biography. But I think, in light of what some people say about him and the claims they make about his personality, it's quite interesting to understand the degree of suffering, because this actually just got worse and worse as he went on in life, because they were refugees. So anyway, to go back to the beginning, a few biographical details are quite well known. Valentin Arnoldovich Tomberg was born in St. Petersburg on February the 26th, 1900. His sun was at exactly the same degree in Aquarius, 14.5, as Rudolf Steiner's was at the time of his own birth in Croatia in 1861. February the 26th, 1900 was actually February the 14th in the old Russian Julian calendar, hence the name Valentin, for Valentine's Day. His parents were Lutheran. His mother Juliana was Russian, and his father Karl Arnold, an Estonian with Baltic German heritage. He had an official position in the government of Nicholas II, last Tsar of Russia. They belonged to quite a high social order in Russia. His brother Richard took this noble title. They were really sort of part of the lower ruling class, if you will. And he was a white Russian, part of the empire. And for the rest of his life, he would see the Bolshevik and the French revolutions as being terrible manifestations of evil in the world. And this colored his life view. He was very, very concerned with world events. I mean, as you would be. I mean, we all are. But, you know, being born in 1900, living through the Russian Revolution, being on the edge of the Russian Civil War in Estonia, you know, then moving to mainland Europe, where he was in Germany, you know, during the time of Hitler. You know, it's, you can't really get much more on the coal face. So he was incredibly tuned into world events. And I just want to say, in addition to the biography I showed you, I've also been reading this book, Valentin Tomberg and the Circle of 12, because this goes into more of the occult anthroposophical aspects of his life, which that's a whole other stream, but I think it's good to bear in mind that these are running in parallel together, and I'll sort of get through as much as I can. But if we just bear in mind, there's the you know, we do have these two streams, as indeed we do meditations on the tarot, where we have the stream of Peter and the stream of John uniting, and that this was his mission to do it. And of course, in addition to this, we've got many publications he wrote himself. I've got, you know, several books here, including meditations on the tarot. We might broadly characterize the stage of his life as there being three stages. There's Russia and all that entailed. You know, there was his Lutheran upbringing, the influence of the Orthodox Church, which is very strong, Mebs, Shmakov, this whole occult, you know, cultural, social scene he was part of. Then from the early 20s up until the brink of World War II, we have the anthroposophical period. Then there's the Catholic conversion comes in the, I think that would be in the early 1940s. Moves to Germany for a while, and then there's a gateway to England and hermeticism, and he becomes the hermit who writes meditations of the tarot while he's in England in later life. It did strike me that these three stages loosely correspond to the degrees of Freemasonry: apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. I don't know if he was a mason. I'd always tended to think not. It would make more sense if he was, because everybody else seemed to be. Everybody in Russia was a mason.
Yeah.
Rudolf Steiner was a mason. You know, practically everybody was a mason who was involved in occultism. Theosophy, you know, was led by masonry. But I don't actually know either way. And of course, he's the sort of person, he'd never talk about it. He did get a lot of help from friends, and I wonder if that was perhaps linked to masonry, but I'm really speculating here, and I just don't know. The first decisive moment in his spiritual life was connected with his mother, and he described the event as a 72-year-old looking back on his life a year before he died, saying, "Just as the most perfect and complicated structures of the world of the living are due to a germ cell, so also does spiritual growth stem from a germ experience and a germ idea." One day, 68 years ago, when the author was a 4-year-old child, he straightened up and, looking outside the window at the blue sky, presented his mother, without any external cause, the question, "Where is God? Is he in heaven? Is he floating there? Or is he sitting there? Where?" Mother also straightened up and gave the following answer: "God is present everywhere. Like the air is invisible, and yet permeates everything, we live and breathe in her, and thanks to her. So live and breathe our souls in God, and live out of him, and thanks to him." This answer was so enlightening and so convincing that she blew away all difficulties of imagination like a breath, leaving the certainty of the omnipresent, invisible God who is the life of souls. This small thought later grew into the height, into the depth, and into the vastness. It was as if it were the primordial cell from which a widely branched tree of insight and the life of faith grew for decades. With her wonderful answer, his mother also introduced him to the method of analogy that's so indispensable to occult studies, which he must have reflected on, I think, throughout his life. I've written quite a bit here about the occultism in Russia, which I'll sort of skip it a little bit, but I think just to a little bit of historical context, the most important currents in the Russian fin de siècle were Theosophy, with Madame Blavatsky, and Spiritism. So he absorbed all this. And actually, I once made a list of all the occult figures who gravitated towards St. Petersburg, and it was absolutely astounding. You know, we didn't just have Blavatsky, you know, Ouspensky, Gurdjieff, Mead, Shmakov, Valentin Tomberg, Rudolf Steiner's wife was Russian. Alistair Crowley ended up there.
Rajiv.
Yep. Yeah. So they all end up there. You know, I think anyway, it seems to have been, the place to be if you were a magician. Valentin had a very Russian spirit. He was famously fluent in many languages, ancient and modern, but when trying to capture intellectual knowledge or experiences, he wrote in Russian until the end of his days. And he also did a lot to hold together the Russian refugee community in Europe. That obviously, he was part of a displaced people, and there was a big community where he escaped to in Estonia. He was a central part in that they helped each other out, that they stayed together, and that lasted for over decades. He was always concerned with what was happening to his fellow Russians. And actually, I did think as well that being Russian might have then started to work against him as the Hitler years took their toll, because obviously the conflict was beginning, and Hitler was very anti-communist. And even though Tomberg wasn't communist, there might have been some anti-Russian feeling in Europe then. They fled the Bolsheviks for Tallinn in 1920. That's where they met the Russian emigre community, which included Nina Rudnikova, and he was initiated into the Mebes inner circle there. And he recalls these people wistfully in Meditations on the Tarot. He says, like the yellow leaves of autumn, forgotten under the immense white blanket of snow that covers pre-revolutionary Russia. Shortly after arriving, I don't know if you're aware, it's sort of often a feature in his biography, he discovered his mother shot dead. So they arrived at Estonia at probably the worst possible time in the revolution. There were armies everywhere. They went into hiding. He himself was imprisoned for a while, and he was in a labor camp for a few months. But he found his mother dead with their small dog tied to a tree. And so we can only imagine how this affected him. This is something he had in common with John Paul II, of course. He'd also lost his mother. There was quite a lot of parallels between their life experiences here, I think. But yeah, he was very close to her, and so we can only imagine. The father and the brother, I believe, lived longer. They drop out of the story in as far as I could read it. But by 1922, the brother is still alive and the father's still around. Valentin Tomberg himself described the 5 great strokes of fate which occurred in his life. These began with his mother's murder, then the easy capture of Paris by the Nazis and the associated fear that there was no counterpower that could defeat Hitler. Then there was the suppression of the uprising in Budapest in 1956. They'd tried to rise up against Russia. Then there was the assassination of President Kennedy, as a result of which all hopes for the liberation of Russia disappeared from him, from the communist liberation. And then there was the death of his great friend, Nikolai Bolotsov. I've not written that full name out, it's a long Russian name. This was one of the most important friendships of his life. News of this friend's death came while he was living in England in the 1940s. On the matter of friendships, this is something I think, this is one reason why the biography becomes complicated, but one thing you really do pick up is that his friends were of absolutely monumental importance to him. They saved his life. These weren't just acquaintances, they were people who financially supported them, took them from a place where they might have died to a safe place, sponsored them every step of the way. He really did have, so even though there was tragedy in the form of schisms and deaths, there were really great friendships of the kind, I think we're all lucky if we can have 1 or 2 friendships like this in a lifetime. And he made many friends like this. I think the force of his personality did attract people to him. By the time he came under the direct influence of Anthroposophy and the tutelage of Rudolf Steiner in his 20s, this was achieved not through face-to-face contact, but by reading books and by an intimate written correspondence. He'd undergone a greater degree of occult initiation than most people could contemplate in several lifetimes. He actually did have an earlier experience. Where did I? The age of 15. I don't know if I haven't made a note of it, but when he was 15, he basically had a spiritual awakening when he realized that his life's mission was to do spiritual work, and that was it. He was set on his path. So while he was still in Russia, and from that moment on, he never deviated. And in his communications with Rudolf Steiner, he talks about this, and he's basically asking Rudolf Steiner to take him on as a pupil, as a special pupil. Even though they can't meet, he reveres Steiner as a guru. He finds in Anthroposophy what is missing in Theosophy, because of course Theosophy is not Christ-centered. He's deeply Christian, and he went through Rudolf Steiner's book, I think How to Know Higher Worlds is the title of this book, and he did the book, and he did this for about 10 years, and he kind of proved to himself that it worked. Eventually,
have you read that, Charlotte? Have you studied How to Know Higher Worlds?
I've got it, and I have read it, but I haven't studied it like this.
It's amazing. I did read it from cover to cover and did the exercises. It was a crucial part of development for me. It was a crucial path to be given some tools. So when I hear that Tomberg did that, and at such a young age, probably, that blows my mind. That blows my mind.
It sort of blows my mind what he did as well, because I think what I was doing at 15.
No kidding,
I did read a lot, but nothing like this. I was going to nightclubs. I partied for 20 years. I did get engaged in spiritual subjects, but no, he was serious about what he was doing.
He's very lucky that he had, to me, it's extraordinary that he had an opportunity like Steiner's How to Know Higher Worlds handbook, because that would just get him right on the straight and narrow path of becoming spiritual scientist. And it would give him a methodology and a discipline. And that would just funnel him right into that work, which is extraordinary in itself as a tool. Because when I found that as a tool, I thought it was extraordinary in my own life. I found it in my 40s.
Yeah, people who read it and get into it like that all say the same. And yeah, I agree. It gave him an absolutely incredible framework. And one thing, it seems that Tomberg, he has this incredible ability to fully absorb an idea, not just an idea, but a whole spiritual stream. He didn't just, he became Anthroposophy. Yeah. He completely, so by the age of, he did become a member. Rudolf Steiner signed the card. I think the same year that he died, in 1925. The Estonian branch of the society was founded, I think around that time, or 1926, with somebody called Otto Sepp as the leader. Tomberg was made the deputy, so he became kind of the deputy. That was his first role in Anthroposophy, was to become the vice president of one of the branches. That's how knowledgeable he was. And that's when he started giving lectures, and also struck up a correspondence with Marie Steiner, who, she inherited the legacy, and they were very close for many years. And he began to ascend through the ranks of Anthroposophy. Then people recognized his abilities. He started to get followers. They loved his lectures, and he was very close to Marie. It did start to go wrong. I'm going off piste here, but I think that's maybe easiest. Otto Sepp died, and this was in 1932. And
who died? Who?
Otto Sepp. So he was the first leader of the Estonian branch of the Anthroposophy Society, where
okay, I was trying to get that name.
Where Tomberg was a member. Even though he was only 32, Tomberg took over. Several things had sort of started to dovetail. As he'd been an official in the Anthroposophical Society, by the way, supporting himself with very meager jobs. He ended up, he was a farm labourer, he was a pharmacist, he was a clerk, he ended up a postmaster, so he's doing all this sort of on the side to earn a crust. And he was married as well. He'd married a friend of his mother's. So this woman, when his mother died, this lady, she was 19 years older than him, and they got married. It was thought to be a marriage of convenience. But he was married. He had this lady, Elena, also very highly regarded in the Anthroposophical Society. He started to travel. So they gave him the means to go and lecture at various places in Europe. He was able to visit Dornach, the home of Anthroposophy. Germany, Holland, or also at a later stage, England. And he went to France as well. Now, where am I? Yeah, he was a prolific lecturer. After Otto Sepp died, hang on, let me go back to my notes, because I know that I'm going to get it mixed up otherwise. What did he say? So it's a door, yeah, Anthroposophy is a doorway. Oh yeah, one thing I did want, what I knew that I'd missing out, is it's perhaps less well known that Rudolf Steiner might have anticipated Valentin Tomberg in a profound spiritual sense and held him in equally high esteem. This is where we start getting into this, the circle of 12 and the esoteric side of the story, because there's a school of thought which is that Rudolf Steiner recognized in Tomberg, even though they didn't meet, his heir, that this was the only person capable of fulfilling the mission that he had set out. Mm-hmm. And to put it in a nutshell, the ultimate goal of anthroposophy is to announce and pave the way for the appearance of Christ in the etheric. And that and everything is really towards that goal.
So Steiner becomes the John the Baptist of Tomberg. Isn't that strange to think?
Yeah, and we get into, I mean, if you've gone into this, then you're probably aware that there's a whole series of reincarnations, and you know, I think to do this properly, we'd have to learn all of anthroposophy, wouldn't we? So that's why I was a little bit sort of wondering how much have people gone into this.
I can't speak for Mark, but this is a wonderful putting this together for me, because I've had bits and pieces of this for years, bits and pieces. And what you're doing, the work you're doing is incredibly valuable to put this together, the roadmap for people in the historical setting, because a lot of people who've been in this work or anthroposophical circles or whatever, I bet very few of them know the big picture this way.
Yes, because of course he was suppressed within the mainstream of anthroposophy, and so
yeah.
I mean, I you know, there's another free anthroposophical group which is to this day ostracized and considered absolutely, you know, completely renegade. But I've got a little anecdote here, which, well, I'll listen to this and see if this might have sown the seed from an angle that actually I'm not sure that has been thought of before. So rewinding a little bit into the 1920s, still in Estonia, he's still lecturing at the society. Now that it was said that he made such great progress in his spiritual development that dark occult groups in Estonia became increasingly aware of him. According to an acquaintance who knew them both, they wanted to use him as a tool for their dark purposes. Who might they have been? It's not said, but I think it's likely they were on the Red Russian side, because that was a deeply occult movement. The acquaintance, who is not mentioned by name, gave Tomberg more details about the plan of the order that observed him. It's actually an order, as well as about other people who were also to serve the purpose of this order. Of these people, only Tomberg was a member of the Anthroposophical Society, and he wrote a letter to Marie Steiner. He became very concerned about this. He took it seriously. He wrote to Marie Steiner. This is what he said. It was said of me alone that I am a person who has not yet recognized his opportunities, but who, when he recognizes them, will hinder our cause in Russia, our being the Dark Order. Now he's being taught by Dr. Steiner, but if he succeeds in establishing a connection with that spiritual entity behind anthroposophy, if he becomes its tool, then he will be able to seriously harm us. Further, my acquaintance told me what he was told, which is that if someone bothers us, the Dark Order, then we warn him. If the warning does not work, then we tear out his mental center, and after 5 to 6 months, he will go crazy. My acquaintance also informed me that in his opinion, although he can't prove it, they really could threaten me with such a danger. In his opinion, they form a chain, and by themselves, gathering at rhythmic intervals, they direct their united forces of thought and will to anyone they choose. I mean, that to me is a penny drop moment.
Oh my God.
I know, because there you see why it happened. Why, you know, if you just take this at its face value, you know, we are believers, you know, we know there are spiritual forces that work for good and evil. So did Tomberg. You know, he clearly took this seriously, because he knew. I mean, even in the circle of Meads, as I mentioned last week, they were taught light and dark initiations. We accepted that there's a reason for that, because you need to prepare people for what will come. However, it's also a fact that of the Meads pupils, some of them definitely went on to perform black magic. I mean, some of the, not necessarily for bad reasons. I think it was a every man for himself situation. But some of the things they did were, you know, put Aleister Crowley in the shade. So people did these things. You know, the Bolshevik Revolution. You know, Stalin was a former priest. You know, when he came later, Lenin was a 33-degree Mason. These were true black magicians. Now, if they recognized being close to him physically, Tomberg, as being the person that, you know, he's perhaps mooted to be somebody who is, you know, of such spiritual import that he could thwart the whole of the Bolshevik movement, then they're certainly capable of targeting this person. And of course, you know, he did end up being ejected from the Anthroposophical Society and severed from this spiritual being behind anthroposophy, which then became subverted. So I saw that as a real, okay, this is how we solve going back. I know.
That's mind-blowing. And, you know, the thing is that people, your average person who studies history, do you think that they think much about the forces behind some of the events in history, the figures who appear in history? Do you think they're thinking much about the occult forces here? And people just, you know, it's interesting, Charlotte, to me that people shy away from this. They really do. People are usually like, oh, I don't want to, that's evil stuff. I don't want to talk or think about that. And I think that I really hope that you can consider this when you're working in your work. It's why is it that so much of this has been veiled from us to the point where we just want to like not know about it? It becomes a blindsided. We become blindsided because we are absolutely, we are trained or indoctrinated in some way to think, oh, don't look at those people behind the curtain over there. Just don't do that, because that will just derail our whole story.
There is deep-seated genetic trauma from inquisitions and feudal systems and, you know, relentless wars.
Yeah.
This occultism tended to be at this level an elite activity, which then gets people's back up. They think, well, you know, they really want to know, but because they can't gain access or couldn't, and now I think it's different. Now I think they could, but then now I think the knowledge has largely gone, and they're not as effective because obviously a smaller group can concentrate that effect more easily than a large one. So I do think there's multiple reasons, but I think, yeah, and it's also has been hidden. And if you're a historian, you know, it wasn't always thus. You know, his history used to be more of an art, but I think I can't remember the historian that Rudolf Steiner pointed to. You know, his name completely escapes me. I should know it, but he's basically considered one of the greatest historians of all time. But he just focused on facts. He went into the archives and he started documenting. And of course, you do need the facts, because what you ideally need is you need to see exactly the chain of events, and then you need to understand the force behind it. Before, we perhaps didn't have the good archiving, you know, to bring out, or people didn't make that much of it. But then in the process, we lost the other side. So, yeah, I agree, though. Most people, I don't think, do look. I think it's just too much, because the questions become huge and you have to really be looking at the wood and instead of looking at the trees, don't you?
I just think that there's a blanket that's been placed on this, just a blanket, a veil that has just been placed on this. And I think people are the more ignorant for it. And I think it's dangerous, actually. I think it's become—
And that's a Bolshevik effect as well, because they wanted to have everyone just kill God, you know, and just not think about anything spiritual whatsoever. So that whole communist egregore is against spirituality, and Nazism claims to be, that was then looking at the dark side. So, you would have expected and hoped that Anthroposophy would have known better. But I think, the loss of Rudolf Steiner was so great that they just lost their way because of that. And there were dark forces against them. He did ask Marie Steiner for advice, but there's no reply actually to that. I don't think she was snobbing him. I think there just wasn't a reply. Sort of go back to perhaps some lighter things. I found it interesting that he went to Paris, and I thought you could only imagine what Tomberg in Paris, the people he would meet in late 1920s Paris. I mean, Henry Bergson, perhaps, who he writes of with great reverence, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, perhaps he could have met Stravinsky, Chagall. He also became in contact with his wife. So that's the next thing, because where I kind of broke off is that the schism was developing. So 1932 to 33 were turning point years in his life. He assumed the leadership of the Anthroposophical Society in Estonia, and he met his future wife, Marie, who was, at the time, the wife in name only of the good friend Nikolai with the long name, who I mentioned earlier. That had also been a marriage of convenience. He had rescued her from a labor camp. So he'd married this lady to rescue her. And they remained, that he remarried, and both couples remained incredibly good friends, the best of friends forever. They were all completely in harmony about it. He met the love of his life. This second marriage, I've written, not only constituted the great union of his earthly life, but also helped to catalyze the great schism, because people just did not approve of this arrangement. He'd carried on, he'd divorced Elena. She wasn't happy about it. They'd reckoned on everybody understanding. Well, she didn't. She wasn't happy. They were all supposed to live together. They did, because he keeps writing to Marie Steiner to try and gain approval. In the meantime, his wife is also writing to Marie Steiner saying, I don't like this. And they seemed to take her side. Carried on looking after her. When his son was born, Alexei, I think 1932, Elena took on the role of grandmother. They're all living together, sort of happy families, but it wasn't, they weren't happy about it. So anyway, Marie Tomberg, all the same, is someone we must be better acquainted with in order to gain a fuller understanding of her husband. Not least of all, his meditations on the tarot was a collaboration between them. She became indispensable to him in every way, and he's repeatedly trying to defend their relationship. Actually, they died within 2 weeks of each other. He died in 1973 in Mallorca. 2 weeks later, she died. So they were utterly united.
They were twin souls, probably.
They were absolutely. I do go into a little bit. What do I say about her? And she became a bit of a gatekeeper. When he became the leader, he also suddenly became a guru to everybody, and more and more pressure from this, which I don't think he liked that side of it. As Rudolf Steiner didn't like it either, even though it was inevitable. There was a perception that he fell in love and she took him away from them, which it always happens, doesn't it? You meet your soulmate, that's it, you spend your time together. They felt she took him away. So people didn't like her unjustly. The two of them had much in common. Marie was from an aristocratic Russian family who, like the Tombergs, had to flee St. Petersburg in dramatic fashion, in her case by a stormy seas right in the Gulf of Finland, evading Red Army searchlights. She'd previously lived a life of luxury with rich relatives. Her own mother had also died young. This involved traveling around the Himalayas and a thorough grounding in the theosophical and other occult principles of the time. She'd attended the best schools, had even been presented to the Tsarina, and heard lectures given by Meads at the Page Corps. So maybe they had crossed paths somehow, like ships in the night. She'd also met Rudolf Steiner, made a very favourable impression on him, and was in every way an intellectual match for Valentin Tomberg, which, saying something. She was also a wonderful pianist. And by the time he met her in Paris, this talented countess, as she was known, had many male suitors. She was a catch. And I think they had the potential to be an occult power couple, like the Ruriks or the Steiners. Not as flashy, but I think they obviously, you know, they were from an upper class milieu, and their rightful place would have been to lead salons and maintain this tradition. But they were at the turning of an age, and it wasn't to be. Now, I'm going to go off piste again, because since I wrote all this, I've kind of I've been reading more. He began to do more of his own independent work, as you said yourself at the very start of this, rather than just repeat the words of Rudolf Steiner. He advanced the work, took on Anthroposophy, and did his own independent spiritual investigations. Even though he said he owed everything to Rudolf Steiner, his followers were now asking him, they recognized what he was, and they said, you know, we want to hear your words now. And so he started to publish lectures of his own, all within Anthroposophy. But this started to attract attention, and you know, it got, and also the Anthroposophical Society was beginning to split anyway, between the ones who just wanted to stick like glue to Rudolf Steiner, who in their eyes was the end of the initiates, the last word, and the others who said, well, actually, you know, we need to prepare the way for Christ in the etheric. Tomberg began to publish, this is by the group that sort of followed him, 1933, when he published his Old Testament studies, which are published in Christ and Sophia.
Are those all in one book? Because I have little slivers of his studies. I have like his Old Testament studies and some of his New Testament studies, but I have them in these little tomes that I treasure. And they are all in that book again, the Christ Sophia. Are they in there?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Christ and the Etheric is in here. So they've collated this, and this is fantastic, this book. And it has a really wonderful introduction by Christopher Bamford, and is really, you know, the book of our times, I would say.
What's it called? Christ Sophia? What's it called?
Yeah. And under his own name as well.
Oh my gosh, I've never seen that before.
Oh, this is an amazing book. You'd love this.
No, absolutely.
So that sort of encapsulates, that's the anthroposophical companion to meditations, really. So he began to publish these works, which started to blow minds, because, you know, I mean, if you've read The Return of Christ in the Etheric, that is the masterwork of anthroposophy. It's the pinnacle. It's kind of like, you know, this is it, folks. This is what
right.
we've been.
Steiner, Christ as mystical fact and all that, right?
Oh yeah, but you know that Tomberg produced The Return of Christ in the Etheric. That was his.
Oh, okay.
Right. So he began to produce lectures, which were so good that when he first wrote The Return of Christ in the Etheric, at first people believed Rudolf Steiner had written it.
Wow.
And they started saying, oh, here's the lost work of the master. When it turned out to be Valentin Tomberg, that was cognitive dissonance of a level that they weren't ready for. More and more, you know, I don't know if you've heard of Elizabeth Breed. You know, I referred earlier to certain friendships he formed. He did have his supporters in the society. They were actually expelled before him because they were more senior and they were of the ruling council. There's a group of people that Steiner left in control as a board of directors, if you like, of his legacy. Half of these, the Tombergians, basically got kicked out. And things got worse and worse until around 1936, 1938, there came an absolutely almighty conflict with them.
What was Elizabeth Breed's role in this?
So she was a senior member of the Anthroposophical Society during Rudolf Steiner's life. And
okay, so she was in that camp though then.
Oh yeah, she was an official member. Oh. Yeah. Now, I don't know if you know that I've heard of the idea that there was a Platonic stream and an Aristotelian stream in Anthroposophy. This is what Rudolf Steiner said himself, that there is souls incarnate as groups, and I mean, I hope I'm getting this right. You know, I'm trying my best to sort of praise it. And there are two sort of major streams of souls working in the spiritual world. some come from the stream of Aristotle, which he said was included himself and most of the people in the Anthroposophical Society. And he said that they basically originated from a pagan time, and like Aristotle, had essentially a scientific mindset, which is in keeping with anthroposophy, whereby you study nature and gradually work your way up to the spiritual realms through those steps through nature. He contrasted this with the Platonic stream, which is the stream that got pushed out. And now it's believed that he recognized Valentin Tomberg as the leader of the Platonic school. And certainly Elizabeth Breed and some of the others who were booted out, they were also Platonists. And then when she met Tomberg, this is before this happened, they immediately recognized each other as soul friends. As Tomberg writes in Meditations of the Tarot, you recognize these people by the fact you love them, you have an affinity, and she recognized him for what he was. I kept sort of saving bits. I tried to sort of, because it's quite interesting what she says about him, but I think I've sort of tagged all the wrong pages.
Wow.
So her concern, so Willie Sucher, Valentin Tomberg were representatives of the Platonic stream. Her concern was that the Platonists should be able to find their place within a society that's dominated by Aristotle. And she wrote about this Platonist teacher. The being of anthroposophy I've always felt to be a newly created spiritual being, created with the help of Dr. Steiner, so to say, the first hierarchical being generated by human beings. This being is very young and relatively undeveloped, like a child, a being that has to develop further through our working together as a community of spiritual knowledge and under the guidance of its creator from the spiritual world. Precisely on this account, I find it so painful when, again and again, such hostile attacks are launched against some active members with a view to excluding them from their work of co-creation of the being of anthroposophy. She was referring to Valentin Tomberg, who by this point was under attack. So having been attacked by the Dark Occult group in Estonia, they were now under attack from within anthroposophy in a very serious way. An observer of the situation wrote, this is when it finally all came to a head, "It is namelessly sad to see how lonely and alone Mr. Tomberg now stands. 10 years of unselfish, dedicated work in which he, with all his being, gave himself to this much loved work. This work was everything to him, a vital necessity to himself. Whole streams of spirit have flowed into our lives through him. And what is our thanks? He gave himself to us entirely. Yes, he thanks us so often that he was allowed to work with us and amongst us. And we have let him go, without thanks, without trust, only criticism, accusations, and personal petty settlements in the heart. He stands alone. A very small circle of friends surrounds him, in firm confidence that all accusations of malice and falsehood are based on untruths. It is not true that Mr. and Mrs. Tomberg are teaching their own esoteric doctrines. It is untrue that they fail to work in the spirit of Rudolf Steiner. With their hearts they see how dark forces are tirelessly at work, poisoning the great general Anthroposophical Society and the work of Rudolf Steiner. I often have the feeling that Mr. Tomberg, here in the lonely far northeast, resembles our hard granite blocks at which surging, foaming waters are thrown. In order to continue, he has to be a hard rock, but he is at his lowest ebb. True and true to the deepest soul is at his side his wife, who supports him through illness, through slander, and through indescribable wants and shattering worries, unspeakably lonely, from daily heavy burdens plagued. So, and around this time, and there's a nice letter here, so they're very deeply working with religious and philosophical ideas about the salvation of humanity, these two. It becomes serious work now. And he wrote to his friend Maria Lichtmes in Amsterdam about the building of an ark. He said, this is actually quite telling because they've just had a flood in Germany, a terrible flood.
Yes.
He said, I mean, awful. In the present day, we are experiencing the rise of an overpowering evil, a kind of flood. The awakening of evil is an inundation. It is directly at work in everyday consciousness. In such a flood, it is a case of sink or swim. This is the trial which consciousness is undergoing. Rescue, however, comes from the principle of an ark. What is it to build an ark? It is to build in consciousness a four-square edifice whose length, breadth, and height are such that they can contain everything in the whole expanse of life. All cultural values and truths are to be gathered and conserved in extract. Unextinguished recollection of everything essential in the good and true. This is the life raft which will prevent us from drowning. Now, when the darkness has come up over humanity's head, it is a question of carrying the ark in one's consciousness, that is, of remembering all the essential values of culture. The result of this is that man will not wither in the life of his soul, his spiritual body. He will remain alive with his soul. From the carrying of the ark of recollection within come faith, hope, and love. When a truth has become so strong that it enters in our spiritual body, it becomes faith, hope, and love. So here we see one of Tomberg's key concerns from the second half of his life, which is that the thread of tradition is not to be broken. And that's why we have the synthesis work of meditations at the end of his life. But rather, all that is true and precious in the history of mankind is to be collected and grasped in its wisdom and depth. Only on this basis is it possible to plant new, strong impulses in history. Yeah. Now, the backdrop in which he was working, they were working in Germany, were just shocking. They mentioned Bonn. It's Bonn that's just been destroyed by the flood. Over 100 people died. It's a very big disaster in Germany, actually, at the moment.
What just happened? It was in Bonn?
That's one of the areas, yeah. It's the Palatine area of central Germany. It's absolutely shocking. And this is where...
How does that happen, Charlotte? I didn't know anything about rains.
A river burst in Switzerland, and then lots of rivers burst. They had a rain, which has been like a monsoon, and dams are bursting, and same in Holland. But we've got glorious weather here for once. So they were working in Bonn, and Bonn in October 1944 became a prime target of the Allies, who wanted to test a new version of their radio bombing system. Bonn was deemed the ideal target. On October the 18th, it was destroyed. So, I mean, we often hear about what happens in England, but here's something that happened in Germany at this time. Ernst von Hippel wrote to his wife. When Bonn, as you have no doubt heard, was attacked, a number of bombs were also dropped on Godesberg. Worst of all, the hospital from across Feist's house was hit. 4 sisters were killed, as well as some 60 soldiers. Later on, Tomberg and I went up to the castle, from which we could see Bonn in flames. From a distance, it was like some ancient picture of a battle. There were white columns of smoke in about 20 places, and in the background, there were dark masses of smoke. It made us feel indescribably anguished to see them. The other day, Valentin and I cut through the grating in the coal cellar with a steel saw so that we could get out through the window in an emergency. After the raid, we had no gas in the house until yesterday, but now it's working again. Recently, Cologne has been bombed every day, and yesterday was a strange day. Valentin passed 2 of the 3 stages of his doctoral viva with marks of very good and excellent, and tomorrow we're going to Bad Honnef so that Kunders can viva him. In Cologne, the university took 3 direct hits, and we can hardly keep going any longer. The University of Bonn has just been burned down, as Elizabeth found out when she visited. It is rumoured that the Bonn academics are to go to Göttingen and those from Cologne to Marburg. I've not been notified of anything, and I will see if we can stay here. So they were living, I mean, I found it hard to, I didn't read in that much detail what was happening because I couldn't get through it in time, but they were basically living through constant bombing whilst doing these doctorates, and it was just relentless. However, it does say that during this period, his spirits were actually quite high because he felt he was doing important work. He had this friendship with Ernst von Hippel, which was incredibly fruitful and financially supportive as well, which they needed because they were penniless. He believed that he was on the road to an academic career because he was able to take on an assistant professorship job at the university. He did incredibly well, as you would imagine, in his studies. And, he felt that he found the right path, that in this field of law, he could finally do some good. And it says here, everybody remained it was extremely difficult for everyone externally, but inwardly everyone was highly animated and full of idealism and a sense of responsibility for a new moral beginning from within. Now, I didn't quite come to understand why he left Germany. I can imagine that after at the end of the war, it was, maybe deemed too dangerous. But for one reason or another, they had an invitation to come to England in 1948. This was the first bit I read the biography, because I was just, fascinated to hear what he'd lived not too far from where I live, about an hour's drive, and I wanted to know about this. Again, he was sponsored by somebody called Francis Collins, who'd met them while they were working with doing the Allied resistance in Holland and in Germany later. So this Francis Collins was in the army. He immediately recognized a sort of guru in Valentin Tomberg, wanted him to be close to them, came from this wealthy family. He showed his mother. It does share that story about how she saw the picture of them looking absolutely kind of bedraggled and thin and sad, and she said she felt terribly depressed because she didn't believe her son would be able to maintain them, because England also after the war was practically bankrupt and destitute. But she gave her permission for him to invite them actually as his housekeepers, because that was the only way you had to have a reason to come, an appointment. So that they came as Francis's housekeepers.
Imagine, oh my God.
I know, and they were brought to England. Now this is a nice part of the story, because they are absolutely ecstatic when they arrive in England. They feel that they're safe. They're suddenly, they're not in Nazi Germany anymore. They've got this lovely person is helping them. They love London. He describes how he finds it very cosmopolitan, that everybody's really polite, friendly, very and one thing he does, this is the reasons why they stayed. They had a chance to go to Germany later, and even though they had friends in Germany, they said that there was no racism in England and that there's nobody bothered about your race, and so that was why they chose to stay. And their son was also doing very, very well at Cambridge. These were all factors, because even though life in England started out well, it didn't become a happy time. He couldn't find work at all. I mean, they missed their friends terribly. They had these prayer circles. They'd had Ernst von Hippel had been working with them, and they didn't really, even though everybody was friendly and polite in England, they didn't really manage to make the great friendships that he needed for his soul life. We get the impression that Tomberg, he's very emotional, he's strongly empathetic character, a Russian spirit, and he needs to connect with people in a warm way. This was missing, and I can completely imagine how in England of the 1940s, everybody talks like this, they're on the BBC, and that it's a very, people had just gone through the war, and it was very tough, and he probably could have found it, but it wasn't. I think there was probably a misunderstanding, like a cultural difference there that they didn't quite get through. He couldn't get a job, so he'd gone from having a good academic career in Germany to being unable to get work. He's written a job application here. Dear Sir, with reference to your advertisement in the Times of August the 23rd, 1948, the necessary dates of my qualifications are as follows. I was born on February the 27th, he says, he always gave that as his date of birth for some reason, 1900 in St. Petersburg. I own the Estonian nationality, which means that I am practically stateless since the annex of the Estonia by the Soviet Union. I studied law at the University of St. Petersburg, the University of Tartu, and the University of Cologne, along with others. And at the latter university, I obtained the doctorate of jurisprudence with the title with distinction. Since the war, I have published 2 books in Germany, one on law in general and the other on international law. Both books were successful, both in qualified reviews and with the public, selling out within a few months. The first with a circulation of 15,000 copies, the second 5,000. International law and international relations were also the basis of my lectures at the Technical University of Aachen in 1947 1998, a position which I gave up because of my relocation to Great Britain in July 1948. At the same time as my lectureship, I worked for the British military government as a consultant for adult education and organised and led university training courses on international relations, during which various professors from the universities of Cologne, Bonn, Munster and Aachen gave a series of lectures. I myself held about 25 lectures and organised and conducted evening courses for adults with an average of 36 hours a week, attended by up to 1,100 students. I also gave lectures on international law, all kinds of other types of law at different academies. I speak English, Russian, Estonian, French, Dutch, and I'm fluent in German. I have some knowledge of Spanish, sufficient to read and understand. I also understand Polish and Ukrainian. I can speak 3 dead languages, Latin, Greek, and Old Bulgarian, also Sanskrit and Hebrew, I believe.
Oh
From experience, I'm familiar with the following countries: Russia, the Baltic states, Finland, Germany, France, Switzerland, Poland, and Holland. My marital status is married with a son of 15 years. He then gives references. I mean, the thought of somebody like him writing a job application, which he didn't get, is just, mad. And this, they just had poverty. I mean, one thing I'd also discovered, because they would have had ration cards, they couldn't even use the luxury items because they couldn't make up the pennies to pay for them. But one thing they did find money for was cigarettes. He smoked like a chimney, apparently, which I was really, really surprised about. I don't know why. I mean, everybody smoked, I think, in England at that time. But just the thought, because there's letters Maria's writing, he's gone to buy 2 sorts of cigarettes. It's like, really?
We can't
didn't know that.
water or sugar, but or flour.
Yeah, that's hysterical. So,
oh my God.
So they're living this life and they're trying to, they end up trying to grow food. In later years, I think in the 1960s, he wrote that since 1940, they'd not been warm. They couldn't afford heating. They both became ill, and she had terrible arthritis and was in pain all the time. And, they're writing these letters. They terribly miss their friends. I mean, she writes how he cries a lot. All the signs were there of quite a serious depression.
Oh God.
And the suffering increased, even though they said, that life around them is everybody's being so nice to them. Really, people liked them a lot. And actually, when I read because he eventually did get a job at the BBC, and his work, it's ironic, but he was a translated during the Cold War, intercepting messages from Moscow. So his work was absolutely invaluable, actually. But it was like a crucifixion, because all day, every day, he had to hear what he just said, despicable lies, propaganda, the very thing he knew he wanted to work against, day in, day out, is kind of soaking into his soul. And this was just, I think, almost destroyed him. He also had to live in Reading, away from his family, and they were so close. He didn't want to do that. He had a house with no heating. It was just all really, really, just terrible. But and even though he had fantastic relationships with his colleagues, and he describes those, how everybody, they got on incredibly well, he never felt they were close to anybody. But when they wrote about him, they felt that they were all getting along quite well. And I think, of course, they had no idea of who he was, because this spiritual side to him was just completely hidden. They had no clue. So really the only spiritual input they get is they're, again, writing letters. So these dear unknown friends, these are really, this is obviously what he needed to pour his heart out into this book, because all his soul and emotional life, their life as a family, was going into these letters to their friends who were on the continent. One joy in his life, they also had visits. I'm sort of painting a bit of a bleak picture, but there were high points and good things happened. Their son was an absolute joy, very, very successful at school, top of his class and everything, as you might expect, with these parents at home. And that was the reason they ended up staying in England, a main reason, because he was thriving here. So that went well. He had Francis Collins, who did what he could to help. He had visits from, I think, von Hippel's daughters came to university in Cambridge. So they had these these contacts, but he just missed seeing them. Yeah, he missed the people.
He's
basically.
he's like the poster boy. They are like the poster children of the suffering Russian soul.
They really, really are. I mean, another friend here who kind of, these people who just recognize this great guru when they see him. He was the Polish artist, Stefan Lubienski, who wrote about the Tombergs in his autobiography, Beyond the Threshold. He said, this is quite a bad translation. She, rather small, with a graceful, noble face like a French miniature, with a touch of medieval chivalry, with much inner shyness radiating from this petite figure. Striking were her large, dark brown, warm eyes. He was visibly in a body that did not suit him. His body was bony, with a large skull, slightly covered with a fine blonde fluff instead of hair, as one sees in infants, observing it with devotion and then discovering his inner spirit. It was said that he embodied a very deep seriousness. Then again, as a kind of compensation, one rejoiced in his smile, which as open and graceful as could be. If one spoke to him, then his extremely low-lying eyes, not those of a beggar for the spiritual with which one might otherwise be inclined to compare him, but that of a very old, very white, or spiritual, I think he means, man, who radiated a world-enveloping goodness and saw much that others did not notice. He liked to make himself ridiculous with quiet derision and humour, and I couldn't quite translate this, but I think he always introduces another person with himself who he calls his uncle, like an alter ego for Tomberg himself, about whom he told all possible anecdotes, often contrary to his own behaviour, but so witty that you felt relaxed and ready to engage. A lot of people talk about his wit. It's obviously like a Russian humour. These two people and their warm hospitality created a soul atmosphere in which I felt immediately at home. In him, I suspected someone who knew much more than I did, and this with a much greater accuracy, care, and responsibility. He revealed a love for Rudolf Steiner that was permeated with reverence, but unfortunately he'd not met. And he goes on to say that basically he was absolutely compelled to pour out his life history to Tomberg, to the point that his tongue hurt. He couldn't stop speaking. And he wrote, "What I saw in those 5 days in northeastern Europe in a small place is enough for my whole lifetime." So he made a seismic impression. I'm actually reminded of an anecdote I heard about a girl who ran into an old man who resembled a wizard in Central Park, and this encounter just was kind of almost the pivotal moment of her whole life, and it turned out it was Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Really?
It just run into the guy, and he was like, that was it. She ran into a great initiate. Now, how long have we been going? Because I'm conscious that probably.
Well, we're at our time, but we started 5 minutes late. Because so do you? How much longer do you want to go? A few more minutes? I'm happy about Mark.
You see, I've got quite. See, there's sort of a cutting off point because I tried to go into some of the more esoteric stuff, like the Bodhisattva question. I think if we go down that road, we'll be here for longer.
Why don't we do this as a part 2? Do you think we could do this next time?
Yeah, I think so. And perhaps we can sort of make it like a discussion, because I'm not sure I have I'm not a real anthroposophist. I would hope to be confident of getting this right. If I'm going to, because we're talking about these streams of reincarnation, to sort of try to put it in a nutshell, there's this idea that there's 3 great initiates and teachers whose spiritual streams are at work. One of these would be the School of Moses, which I believe Rudolf Steiner was a representative of. Then there's the School of Abraham, as they see it, who they believe Tomberg was a representative of. And then we have an Elijah John figure, and there are theories about who that was or is.
Really? Who would that be, you think?
So all of this is an anthroposophical theory, just to start with. Rudolf Steiner wrote a lot about reincarnation and these streams like Plato and Aristotle, and there's an idea that the Bodhisattva will be the one who announces the etheric Christ. So this is why we have Tomberg sort of coming into this. There's actually an idea, this book, the reason it's called The Circle of 12 is that's representative of the zodiac. and that there's 12, it becomes cosmic, astrological, and you know what Anthroposophy, we're talking about a huge cosmology here.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh yeah.
So,
Yeah, no,
we've
this
got
is
12 streams.
this is amazing stuff, and I would love to have that be a second part. And I was wondering if do you know of anybody who might be invited to come and discuss, maybe who's could be a part of the discussion, who's anthroposophist? I don't know if you know of anybody that might want to do that. I certainly cannot
Well,
think of.
see, the best person, of course, is Robert Powell.
Oh, well, let's get him on.
We could ask him, because really, I can only imagine, his horror if somebody tried to tell that story and got it wrong. Spiritual groups around Europe in the places where Valentin Tomberg. So Valentin Tomberg did manage to get himself to Assisi, to Florence. There's an idea that he's the reincarnation of a Grail character called William of Orange, not the William of Orange who
not Prince William of Orange.
Not the one who met Ireland. No, an island. No, thank goodness. No, a different one. So there's this whole I mean, obviously it's speculative. I think we have to be. We have no idea if this is something he would have approved of, or so we have to praise it. But there is this amazing body of knowledge, and yes, they do have ideas about who they think is the Elijah John being. He actually believes it's Judith von Haller. I don't know if you've heard of her. I am more inclined to think it could have been John Paul II, but I think the point is we don't know. When I heard about the idea of the Circle of 12, the one thing, and this is sort of what I got to towards the end of my talk here, is that I think we are being invited and encouraged to activate our own intuition. Yeah. So I think if we're going to go into this subject, we just have to sort of be clear that it's with an open mind, that nobody's trying to set something in stone here, and if you have an idea, if you think that this character was Bob Marley, maybe, I think we have to have their own ideas.
I think if Charlotte, of any circle to put this out to, where people might be invited to come in and have an intuitive discussion. If you know of anybody who might be interested in that, we could give some time to prepare for that, because wouldn't that just be fascinating?
I think it would. I think it would work better as a discussion. Like I said, I mean, I could make something, but I just think it's better for us all to talk about it, and then we can all share what we know and what we think, and nobody's kind of ideas are put too strongly upon it. There are lots of people who might be interested. I mean, certainly the anthroposophical Tombergians have got strong ideas about this one, so they might quite like to have a say and to get some ideas out there.
Why don't we give this some thought then, if you don't mind? We figure out whether there are a couple people that could be invited for a roundtable. Mm-hmm. Because I tell you, I know that I'm sure that this is pretty groundbreaking work, and I'm sure people out there that will be interested in this.
There would be, yeah, and it's of course, and if we could get somebody of Robert Powell's, because he is just a wonderful, wonderful teacher of this whole thing. He really is, in this whole stream. It's obviously published Meditations on the Tarot, and also much of this original research is done by him, and like Claudia, I mean, maybe even Claudia, who wrote the book The Circle of 12, which I keep losing. Maybe she could, because she obviously is very well versed in the whole thing, and she might be able to explain better. Because certainly when I started going into the whole bodhisattva thing, I'm thinking, whoa, am I getting this right? And who's reincarnated from who? And
Because I think putting minds together right now to create this arc of the tradition, I think that's what we're being asked to do. It's an arc of consciousness that we need to gather together right now and put together what we have so far, so that maybe there can be an intuitive leap.
And if we have managed to put our finger on the problem, like this dark occult group in Estonia, I always think back to where do these things begin? Like, for example, I think that Aleister Crowley's the Babylon workings that they did, I think certain things were unleashed at that time, in America, you know, Jack Parsons, you know, you can look at events and think, okay, that opened a door and we're still not closed that door. That was a Pandora's box, you know, thing, you know, we haven't figured out now how to counteract certain black magical acts. Now we've had it, you know, put to us plainly that a black occult group was trying to destroy the work of Tomberg, actually him personally, and that this could well have been why the Anthroposophical Society, this gives them their lifeline in a way, because they've nailed themselves as a group into almost a tomb with Rudolf Steiner by rejecting, in my opinion, Valentin Tomberg, who even if they didn't have to believe he was the heir of Rudolf Steiner, why reject such a wonderful soul from the circle, you know, when the work they're doing is so great. I mean, okay, karmically, you know, you can also argue that it was his destiny to also go into the Catholic Church and embrace the Hermetic path. So everything happens for a reason, you know. But maybe it's time to be reconciled, because some of the key figures who were against him have since passed on now.
And there are younger students of Steiner that are out there that I think need to be brought to. I know personally of some that are very deeply into studying Robert Sardello and other you know, people in the anthroposophical movement.
Yeah, I'll speak to some people that I know as well and see if they would like to. I mean, a lot of them are very hermetic types, don't like any attention, but we'll see. We should at least ask.
They dare and they like to be silent. Yes. I understand, but I think this needs to be done now. I think that there is obviously some sort of impulse that we're riding. And I'm so honored that you've come forward, and that, I mean, I feel almost completely out of my depths. It's just absolutely, I'm honored that we have opened up this window, this wormhole of sorts. And I just hope that we can build on it. So, but I don't want to press you, Charlotte. I know you're incredibly busy. I know we all have our lives. Mark is here. Thank goodness. That's so great, because we need to have a grounding. We need to ground this information. We need to bring it into manifestation in a new way. It's very exciting work, and I'm honored. So let's talk about this more. Okay. I'm going to stop the recording right now to pause it.